Olivia Carter had always felt a deep connection to the water. It was more than a place of serenity for her, it was a reflection of her resilience and strength. As a decorated Navy officer, she had spent years in unpredictable and dangerous waters, honing her skills and tempering her spirit. Now, back in her hometown for the first time in years, the calm, mirror-like surface of the lake in the city park seemed almost surreal. It was the same lake she had visited as a child, where her father taught her how to swim and instilled in her the discipline that would one day guide her into a life of service. The memories it evoked brought both peace and a faint pang of melancholy as she walked along the worn dirt path toward the shoreline. Dressed in a simple grey hoodie and black leggings, Olivia carried herself with a confidence that was natural yet unassuming. Her athletic build hinted at years of rigorous physical training, though her soft smile and relaxed pace suggested a person looking for peace rather than conflict. In her hand was a sleek training knife, not a weapon, but a tool she used to practice precision throws as part of her ongoing routine to maintain the focus and discipline that had become second nature to her. It was a crisp, clear morning with the sunlight streaming through the canopy of tall oak trees that framed the path. The air was alive with the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. A few joggers passed her, some nodding politely, others engrossed in their own thoughts. Olivia appreciated the quiet solitude of the area. It was a stark contrast to the chaos and intensity she had left behind on active duty. On the other side of the park, Officer Derek Coulson sat in his patrol car, the engine idling softly as his eyes scanned the surroundings with a mix of boredom and disdain. He was a man worn thin by the grind of a career that hadn't lived up to his expectations. Once ambitious and full of promise, Derek had envisioned himself rising quickly through the ranks, making a name for himself as a capable, respected figure in law enforcement. Instead, he found himself patrolling mundane neighborhoods, dealing with minor infractions and filling out endless reports. The resentment he harbored for his stagnant position was palpable, and it often bled into his interactions with the public. Derek had developed a habit of asserting his authority in ways that masked his insecurities, ways that often bordered on excessive. As he surveyed the park, his attention was drawn to Olivia. From a distance, she appeared as nothing more than a casual walker, but something about her posture and demeanor set him on edge. Perhaps it was the knife in her hand or the air of purpose she carried. But Derek's mind began racing with assumptions. To him, she didn't look like she belonged here, not in this quiet suburban park. The knife, though harmless in context, became a focal point for his suspicion, and without hesitation he decided to investigate. It wasn't the first time Derek had acted on a gut feeling, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Olivia reached the edge of the lake, her footsteps slowing as she took in the serene view. The water shimmered under the morning sun, its surface undisturbed except for the occasional ripple caused by a light breeze. She set down her small backpack on the ground and retrieved a compact wooden target board. Placing it against a tree, she stepped back several paces and began her practice. The knife flew from her hand with practiced precision, embedding itself in the target with a satisfying thud. She retrieved it and repeated the motion, her movements fluid and deliberate. The rhythmic nature of the activity allowed her to focus, to clear her mind of the lingering weight of her responsibilities and experiences. As Derek approached in his patrol car, the sound of the engine broke the natural tranquility of the area. Olivia glanced over her shoulder, her brow furrowing slightly. It wasn't unusual to see a patrol car in the park, but the way it slowed to a stop near her and the sharp glare from the officer inside signaled that this wasn't a routine pass. Derek stepped out of the vehicle, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. He adjusted his utility belt, the action deliberate as though to emphasize the authority he carried. Olivia, recognizing the tension in his demeanor, remained calm. She turned toward him, the knife still in her hand but held loosely at her side. "Good morning, officer," she said politely, her voice steady and unassuming. Derek's eyes narrowed as he glanced from her face to the knife and then back again. He didn't return her greeting. Instead, he took a step closer, his hand instinctively resting near the holster on his hip. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone sharp and devoid of any warmth. Olivia raised an eyebrow, slightly taken aback by his abruptness. "Just practicing," she replied evenly, gesturing toward the target board behind her. "It's a good way to stay sharp and focused." Derek's gaze lingered on the knife, his jaw tightening. "You know it's not exactly normal to walk around with a knife in a public park," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. Olivia maintained her composure, meeting his gaze without flinching. "It's a training knife," she explained, turning it slightly to show the dulled edge. "I'm not a threat to anyone." Her calm demeanor seemed to irritate Derek further. He took another step closer, his tone growing more confrontational. "I don't know who you think you are, but you can't just wander around here doing whatever you please. This is a public space." Olivia exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to let frustration seep into her voice. "I'm not doing anything illegal, officer. I'm just minding my own business." Derek's patience, already thin, began to fray. To him, her calmness felt like defiance, and it only fueled his determination to assert control over the situation. He stepped closer still, the tension between them now palpable. "Hand over the knife," he demanded, his voice rising slightly. Olivia hesitated, sensing that the interaction was spiraling into something far more volatile than it needed to be. "I don't think that's necessary," she said carefully. "I'm not a threat, and I haven't done anything wrong." Derek's expression darkened. "I said, hand it over." The weight of his words hung in the air, to command an unmistakable attempt to force submission. But Olivia didn't move. Her years of training had taught her how to assess situations, how to maintain control, even when faced with unwarranted aggression. She could feel the stares of a few bystanders who had paused in their activities to observe the unfolding scene. Her instinct told her this was only the beginning of what could become a dangerous confrontation. Olivia stood her ground, her steady gaze locked on Officer Coulson as the tension between them thickened. The air, once calm and filled with the gentle sounds of the park, now seemed charged with a quiet hostility. The officer's demand for the knife hung between them, his tone commanding, almost desperate to establish dominance. Olivia, unflinching, could see the barely restrained irritation in his posture, the tightness of his jaw, the rigid way his hand hovered near his holster. She had encountered men like him before, individuals who mistook authority for unchecked power and who saw any perceived resistance as a direct challenge to their position. She knew better than to escalate, but she also knew that handing over her training knife would do nothing to pacify him. It wasn't about the knife. It was about control. "Officer," she began, her voice calm but firm, "this is a misunderstanding. I'm not here to cause any trouble. I'm just practicing with a training tool, which, by the way, isn't against the law. I'd appreciate it if we could de-escalate this situation." Coulson's eyes narrowed further, her measured words only fueling his frustration. He stepped closer, the gravel crunching under his boots, his shadow falling over her like a looming storm cloud. "This isn't up for debate," he snapped. "You don't get to decide what's a threat and what isn't. Hand it over. Now." Olivia sighed internally, sensing that reason was not going to prevail here. She wasn't afraid. Her years in the Navy had prepared her for far worse encounters, but she was acutely aware of how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. Her mind raced as she weighed her options. She could comply, hoping it would end the encounter, but something in Coulson's tone and demeanor told her that compliance wouldn't be enough for him. He wanted submission. On the other hand, refusing outright could provoke him further, and while she was more than capable of defending herself, she didn't want to escalate matters unnecessarily, especially in a public park. "Fine," she said finally, taking a small step back and extending the knife toward him, handle first. "If it'll make you feel better, here you go." Coulson reached out and snatched the knife from her hand, inspecting it with a smug expression as though he'd just disarmed a dangerous criminal. "See?" he said, holding it up as if to make a point. "This is exactly the kind of thing that doesn't belong here. You can't just walk around with something like this and expect people to feel safe." Olivia crossed her arms, her patience wearing thin. "It's a training knife," she reiterated, her tone clipped but controlled, "and no one seemed to have a problem with it until you showed up." Coulson's smirk faltered slightly, her calm defiance unsettling him more than he cared to admit. He hated that she wasn't intimidated by him, that she wasn't scrambling to justify herself or pleading for leniency. It challenged the narrative he had already constructed in his mind that she was a troublemaker, someone out of place and up to no good. He needed to regain control, to reassert his authority, and he wasn't about to let her walk away without making sure she understood who was in charge. "Let me see some ID," he said suddenly, his tone sharp. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Why?" she asked. "I haven't committed a crime and I'm not being detained. There's no reason for you to check my ID." Coulson's face darkened, her refusal to comply with his arbitrary demand stoking the anger simmering beneath his professional facade. "I'm not going to ask again," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Either you show me some ID, or I'll have to assume you're hiding something." Olivia stared at him for a long moment, weighing her next move. She knew her rights, and she knew he didn't have a legal basis for his demand. But she also knew that standing her ground would only agitate him further. Still, she couldn't bring herself to acquiesce not to someone who had already crossed the line. She took a slow, deliberate breath before responding. "With all due respect, officer," she said, her tone as measured as ever, "you don't get to assume anything just because I'm not jumping to follow your orders. If you have a legitimate reason to detain me, then say so. Otherwise, I'd like to go back to enjoying my morning." Coulson's grip tightened around the knife, his knuckles whitening as his frustration reached a boiling point. He wasn't used to being questioned, least of all by someone he already viewed as inferior. To him, her calmness was a form of insolence, a silent challenge to his authority that he couldn't ignore. He took another step forward, now uncomfortably close to her, his voice dropping to a growl. "Listen, lady," he said through gritted teeth. "I don't know who you think you are, but out here, I make the rules. And right now, you're looking a lot like someone who doesn't belong. So either you start cooperating, or things are going to get a lot more complicated for you." Olivia felt her pulse quicken not from fear, but from the rising anger she was struggling to suppress. She was used to being underestimated, to having her competence questioned and her presence scrutinized. It was a reality she had faced throughout her career, both as a woman and as a person of color in a predominantly male and predominantly white institution. But she had always met those challenges with grace and resilience, refusing to let prejudice define her or dictate her actions. This was no different. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "But I'm also not going to stand here and let you bully me into submission. I've done nothing wrong, and you know it." Coulson's face flushed with anger, her words hitting a nerve he didn't even know he had. Without thinking, he stepped even closer, his chest almost brushing against hers as he glared down at her. "Is that so?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, let me tell you something, you don't get to decide what's wrong or right around here. I do. And right now you're looking like someone who needs to learn a lesson." Before Olivia could respond, Coulson made his move. With a sudden burst of aggression, he shoved her backward, his hands colliding with her shoulders and sending her stumbling toward the edge of the lake. The world seemed to slow as she lost her balance, the ground slipping out from under her feet as she tumbled into the cold, dark water below. The shock of the icy lake hit her like a jolt, but years of training kicked in almost instantly, her body reacting before her mind could process what had happened. She surfaced a moment later, gasping for breath as the cold water clung to her skin. Above her, Coulson stood at the edge of the lake, his smirk returning as he looked down at her with a mixture of triumph and disdain. "Maybe that'll cool you off," he sneered, his voice carrying over the water. "Next time, learn to show a little respect." Olivia stared up at him, her breath steadying as a new resolve took hold. She had dealt with bullies before, and she had no intention of letting this one have the last word. Without a word, she turned and began swimming toward the opposite shore, her strokes strong and deliberate despite the cold. Coulson watched her go, his confidence wavering as he realized she wasn't retreating. She was regrouping. And whatever was coming next, he wasn't prepared for it. The cold water of the lake clung to Olivia's body as she swam with steady, deliberate strokes, each one calculated and precise. Years of military training had conditioned her to remain calm under pressure, and while the initial shock of being shoved into the lake had caught her off guard, it hadn't taken long for her instincts to take over. Her mind worked quickly, assessing her options, her surroundings, and, most importantly, her opponent. Officer Coulson was still standing at the edge of the lake, smugly watching her, completely unaware of who he had just provoked. Olivia knew that confronting him immediately would only escalate the situation, and she needed time to strategize. For now, she swam toward the opposite shore, her movements smooth and confident, as though she hadn't just been physically assaulted. Coulson, meanwhile, stood rigidly on the bank, the satisfaction of his actions already beginning to give way to unease. He had expected her to shout, to retaliate in some way, or even to beg for his help. Instead, she had simply disappeared beneath the water, resurfaced without a word, and begun swimming away. Her composure unnerved him more than he cared to admit, though he quickly buried that feeling under a mask of bravado. To him, she was just another person who thought they could challenge authority without consequences. He had dealt with people like her before, or so he thought. What he failed to realize was that Olivia Carter was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. As Olivia reached the far shore, she pulled herself out of the water with ease, her muscles rippling under her wet clothing. She stood for a moment, letting the sun warm her skin as she caught her breath, and assessed the situation. The park was relatively quiet, with only a few bystanders scattered along the paths. Some had stopped to watch the altercation from a distance, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern, but none had intervened. Olivia didn't blame them. Most people wouldn't risk getting involved in a confrontation with a uniformed officer, no matter how unjust his actions might be. Still, she filed their presence away in her mind. Witnesses might prove useful later. From across the water, she could see Coulson pacing along the shore, his posture tense. He had picked up her training knife, twirling it absent-mindedly in his hand as though it were a trophy. The sight ignited a spark of anger within Olivia, but she quickly suppressed it. Anger wouldn't help her now, calculation would. She needed to take control of the situation without letting him drag her down to his level. Reaching into her soaked backpack, Olivia retrieved a small waterproof case. Inside was her military-grade signaling equipment, including a compact flare gun and a high-frequency whistle designed to cut through even the loudest environments. She considered her options carefully. While she wasn't in immediate danger, she couldn't let Coulson's actions go unchecked. This wasn't just about her, it was about accountability and ensuring that he couldn't abuse his authority again. She decided on a measured approach, one that would draw attention to his behavior without escalating the situation into outright violence. As she began walking back along the edge of the lake, her sharp eyes never leaving Coulson, she noticed him finally starting to react. He shouted across the water, his voice carrying but lacking the authority it had earlier. "Hey, you can't just swim off like that. Get back here now." His tone was a mixture of irritation and insecurity, as though he were trying to reassert control but wasn't entirely sure how. Olivia didn't respond. She simply kept walking, her pace steady and deliberate, until she reached a narrow wooden footbridge that spanned the lake. Crossing it calmly, she could feel Coulson's eyes on her the entire time, his frustration mounting with every step she took. By the time she reached his side of the shore, he was waiting for her, his expression dark and his stance aggressive. "You've got a lot of nerve," he spat, stepping closer to her as she approached. "You think you can just ignore me and do whatever you want. That's not how this works." Olivia stopped a few feet away from him, her posture relaxed but her gaze unyielding. Water dripped from her hair and clothing, but she didn't seem bothered by it. If anything, she looked even more composed than before, as though the lake had washed away not just the physical impact of his shove, but also any lingering doubt or hesitation. "Officer," she said evenly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made him hesitate for a fraction of a second. "You've already crossed the line once. Don't make it worse for yourself." Coulson's face twisted with anger. "Cross the line," he repeated incredulously. "You're the one walking around with a weapon in a public park, refusing to follow orders, and acting like you're above the law. I don't know who you think you are, but—" "You're right," Olivia interrupted, her tone calm but firm. "You don't know who I am. And that's exactly why you should think carefully about your next move." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Coulson seemed to falter. There was something in her voice, in the way she carried herself, that made him question his assumptions. But the doubt was fleeting, quickly replaced by the familiar surge of ego and misplaced confidence that had driven his actions from the start. "I don't need to think about anything," he said, taking another step toward her. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer and for carrying a dangerous weapon. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Olivia didn't move. She didn't flinch or argue. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "And when this is over, you're going to regret it." Coulson let out a harsh laugh, though it sounded more forced than genuine. "Oh, I'm going to regret it," he said mockingly. "Lady, the only mistake here is you thinking you can get away with this." He reached for her arm, his grip rough and unyielding. But Olivia was ready. In one fluid motion, she sidestepped his grasp and used his own momentum against him, twisting his arm and sending him stumbling forward. He barely managed to keep his balance, his face a mask of shock and humiliation as he spun around to face her. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked, his voice rising with anger and embarrassment. "You just assaulted an officer." Olivia remained calm, her stance relaxed but poised. "No, I defended myself," she said evenly. "And I suggest you stop before you embarrass yourself any further." Coulson's hand flew to his radio, his fingers fumbling slightly as he tried to call for backup. Unit 47, I need assistance at the lake. Suspect is resisting and has become violent, he said breathlessly, his voice shaking slightly despite his efforts to sound authoritative. Olivia watched him calmly, her mind already working through the next steps. She knew backup would arrive soon, and while she could handle herself, she also knew she needed to defuse the situation before it escalated further. Reaching into her backpack, she pulled out her waterproof ID badge, the one that bore her rank and credentials as a Navy officer. She held it up, her movements slow and deliberate, making sure he could see it clearly. "Read it," she said, her voice cutting through his frantic movements like a blade. "And then tell me if you still want to go through with this." Coulson froze, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the badge. For a moment he didn't seem to process what he was looking at, but as the words and insignias registered in his mind, the color drained from his face. His hand dropped from his radio, and he stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and dawning realization. He began, but Olivia cut him off. "That's right," she said, her tone steely. "And if you think I'm going to let you get away with this, you've severely underestimated me." Coulson stumbled back, his confidence crumbling as the reality of the situation sank in. But Olivia wasn't done yet. The escalation wasn't over, it was only just beginning. Olivia stood motionless, her Navy Idaho badge still held up, the sunlight glinting off its metallic insignia. She watched Officer Coulson's face shift through a cascade of emotions: shock, disbelief, confusion, and finally, thinly veiled panic. His bravado had evaporated, leaving behind a man who was rapidly trying to reconcile the situation he had just created. For the first time since their confrontation began, Coulson hesitated. His mind raced, grasping for a way to regain the upper hand, but every move he considered seemed to lead back to the same conclusion: he had made a monumental mistake. The tension between them hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed faintly in the distance. Olivia glanced to her side and saw a small crowd beginning to gather at the edge of the park, drawn by the commotion. A few bystanders exchanged whispers, their curious eyes darting between her and Coulson, but no one dared step closer. The tension in the air was palpable, and Olivia could feel it tightening around them like a noose. She lowered her badge, her expression unreadable, and tucked it back into her waterproof bag. Coulson cleared his throat, his voice strained as he attempted to reassert his authority. "I don't care who you are," he said, though the slight tremor in his voice betrayed his nerves. "You're still resisting an officer, and I'm not about to let this slide." Olivia raised an eyebrow, her calm gaze cutting through him like a blade. "You don't care who I am," she repeated, her tone quiet but laced with sharp incredulity. "You should, because if you did, you'd realize just how deep a hole you've dug for yourself." Coulson's hand instinctively tightened around his radio, but he hesitated before speaking into it. He was clearly unsure of what to do next, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like an anchor. Olivia saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes and decided to press further. "You think you can cover this up?" she continued, her voice low and deliberate. "You think no one's going to hear about how you shoved an unarmed woman into a lake without provocation? How you tried to escalate a situation that didn't need to exist in the first place? That badge on your chest doesn't give you the right to act without accountability. And trust me, accountability is coming." Her words hit their mark. Coulson's face flushed with anger, not at her but at the truth she was speaking. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected, and his ego bristled at the idea of being called out so publicly. But he wasn't ready to concede. He couldn't not in front of the growing number of onlookers. "You're twisting this," he said, his voice rising slightly as he tried to regain control. "I gave you multiple opportunities to comply, and you refused. This is on you." Olivia's gaze hardened. "Comply with what, exactly?" she asked, stepping closer to him, her posture unyielding. "Your baseless accusations, your abuse of power. Tell me, Officer Coulson, what exactly did you expect me to do? Bow down? Beg for your forgiveness? No, that's not how this works. Not anymore." Coulson opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of sirens in the distance cut through the tense silence. The backup he had called for earlier was finally arriving. Olivia shifted her weight slightly, her stance ready but not defensive. She wasn't afraid of what was coming next. She had faced far worse. If anything, she welcomed the opportunity to expose Coulson's actions to his peers. 2 patrol cars pulled up near the edge of the park, their lights flashing in rhythmic pulses. 3 officers stepped out, their expressions ranging from confusion to mild concern as they approached the scene. At the front of the group was Sergeant Graham, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a weathered face that spoke of decades of experience. He took one look at Coulson and Olivia, the latter still drenched from her plunge into the lake, and his brow furrowed deeply. "What's going on here?" Graham demanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Coulson straightened his posture, his hand dropping from his radio as he turned to address his superior. "I've got a suspect here," he said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "She was acting suspicious, carrying a weapon in the park, and when I attempted to question her, she resisted." Graham's eyes flicked to Olivia, taking in her composed demeanor and the faint smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. Something about Coulson's explanation didn't sit right with him, and it wasn't hard to see why. Olivia didn't look like a suspect, she looked like someone who had seen this play out 100 times before, and was simply waiting for the inevitable conclusion. "A weapon, huh?" Graham said, his tone skeptical. "Where is it?" Coulson held up the training knife triumphantly, as though it were the smoking gun that would validate his actions. "Right here," he said. "She was using it to, I don't know, practice something." Graham took the knife from him, turning it over in his hands. His expression remained neutral, but Olivia could see the faint twitch of his jaw, a telltale sign of someone suppressing irritation. He glanced back at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "This true?" he asked, his voice measured. Olivia nodded once. "I was practicing precision throws with a training knife. It's dull and completely legal." "I've done nothing wrong, Sergeant." Graham's gaze lingered on her for a moment before shifting back to Coulson. "And you thought this warranted shoving her into a lake?" Coulson bristled, his face reddening as he stammered out a response. "She was being non-compliant, sir. She refused to hand over the knife or show ID, and when I tried to..." "She refused to show ID because she wasn't required to," Olivia interjected, her voice calm but cutting. "And as for the knife, I handed it to you voluntarily before you decided to escalate things." Graham raised a hand, silencing both of them. He turned the knife over in his hands once more before handing it back to Olivia. "Miss, do you have anything on you to identify yourself?" Olivia nodded, reaching into her bag and producing her Navy Idaho badge once again. This time she held it out for Graham to see, and his expression shifted immediately. The skepticism melted away, replaced by something akin to respect or perhaps regret. He let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck as he processed the information. "You're Navy," he said, more a statement than a question. "That's correct," Olivia replied, her voice steady. "Lieutenant Commander Olivia Carter. And what your officer here has done is not only unprofessional but borderline criminal." Graham's lips pressed into a thin line as he turned back to Coulson, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Is that true? Graham asked, his voice low but heavy with authority. Coulson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He glanced between Olivia and Graham, his confidence crumbling under the weight of their combined scrutiny. Olivia could see the wheels turning in his head as he desperately tried to salvage the situation, but there was no way out for him now. I didn't know who she was, Coulson said finally, his voice weak and unconvincing. She was acting suspicious, and I thought. You thought wrong, Graham snapped, cutting him off. And now you've not only embarrassed yourself, but this department as well. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Olivia remained silent, her expression calm but resolute. She had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to them to handle the fallout. Graham sighed heavily, turning back to her. Lieutenant Commander Carter, I can't apologize enough for this. I assure you, there will be a full investigation into Officer Coulson's actions. Olivia nodded, her gaze never leaving Coulson. I'll be filing a formal complaint, she said. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else. Graham nodded solemnly, his respect for her evident in his posture. Understood, he said. And you have my word that it will be taken seriously. As the officers began to disperse, Coulson stood frozen in place, his face a mask of shame and anger. Olivia didn't spare him another glance as she turned and walked away, her steps steady and unyielding. She had won this battle, but she knew the fight for accountability was far from over. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, the calm waters of the lake reflecting her resolve. The silence after Sergeant Graham's words was deafening, but the tension in the air remained thick, pulsing with unspoken conflict. Officer Coulson's face was a storm of emotions, humiliation, rage, fear, all threatening to boil over as he stood frozen on the lakeshore. Olivia watched him out of the corner of her eye as she calmly placed her ID back into her waterproof bag. She didn't flinch, didn't let her guard down for a second. She had seen this type of man before, one who couldn't handle being exposed, who couldn't stand being proven wrong. And she knew, instinctively, that he wasn't done yet. Men like Coulson rarely walked away quietly. Sergeant Graham turned to address the small group of officers who had arrived as he stood sharp and commanding. I want statements from any witnesses here, he barked. Find out exactly what happened before I arrived. And Coulson, you and I are going to have a very long conversation when this is over. Olivia expected Coulson to back down then, to retreat into the shadows and let his superiors handle the mess he'd created. But instead he seemed to dig his heels in, his jaw tightening and his fists clenching at his sides. He couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about his authority anymore, it was personal. Sir, with all due respect, I still believe she's a threat, Coulson said, his voice shaky but loud enough to draw everyone's attention. You saw the knife. You heard how she refused to comply. We can't just let her walk away. Sergeant Graham turned to him slowly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and restrained anger. A threat, he repeated. Coulson, she handed you the knife voluntarily. She identified herself as a Navy officer. The only threat here is your inability to follow protocol. Coulson's face reddened, but he refused to back down. You weren't here, sir, he said, his voice rising. You didn't see how she was acting, how she was trying to provoke me. I was doing my job. Olivia's calm mask began to crack, irritation flickering behind her eyes. She took a step forward, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Your job? She said, her tone sharp. Is that what you call shoving someone into a lake because you couldn't handle being questioned? Is that what you call escalating a situation that never needed to exist in the first place? If this is your version of doing your job, then you have no business wearing that uniform. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Coulson's fists clenched tighter, his knuckles turning white. He couldn't take the hit to his ego, couldn't stand being called out in front of his peers. And in that moment, Olivia saw the decision form in his eyes. He was going to push this further, no matter the consequences. Enough, Coulson snapped, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. He reached for his handcuffs, his movements quick and aggressive. Turn around. You're under arrest for obstructing justice and assaulting an officer. Olivia didn't move. She didn't flinch or react, her posture steady and composed as she stared him down. I didn't assault anyone, she said calmly. And you have no grounds to arrest me. Coulson took a step closer, the cuffs in his hand glinting in the sunlight. I said, turn around, he barked. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Coulson, stand down. Graham's voice boomed, but Coulson ignored him. He was too far gone now, too consumed by his need to regain control. He lunged for Olivia, his hand reaching for her arm, but she was ready. In one fluid motion, Olivia sidestepped his grasp and pivoted, using his momentum against him. Her military training took over, and within seconds, she had him off balance, his arm twisted behind his back and his cuffs clattering to the ground. The other officers froze, stunned by the sudden turn of events. Olivia released him just as quickly, stepping back and raising her hands in a show of non-aggression. Coulson stumbled forward, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. That's enough, Graham roared, stepping between them. He turned to Coulson, his expression thunderous. You're done, Coulson. Hand over your badge and gun. Now. Coulson hesitated, his chest heaving as he looked between Graham and Olivia. For a moment it seemed like he might refuse, that he might push this even further. But the weight of Graham's authority in the eyes of his fellow officers finally broke through his defiance. With trembling hands he unclipped his badge and holstered weapon, handing them over with a look of pure venom directed at Olivia. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low and venomous. Olivia met his gaze unflinching. You're right, she said quietly. It's not. Graham gestured to one of the other officers. Escort him back to the station, he ordered. I'll deal with him personally. As Coulson was led away, his shoulders hunched and his face burning with shame, Olivia allowed herself a small exhale of relief, but she knew the situation was far from resolved. Graham turned back to her, his expression softer but still serious. Lieutenant Commander Carter, he said, his tone formal, I want to apologize for what just happened. Coulson's actions were completely unacceptable, and I'll make sure he's held accountable. Olivia nodded, but her expression remained hard. Apologies aren't enough, Sergeant, she said. This isn't just about me. How many others has he treated like this? How many times has he gotten away with it because there weren't witnesses, or because the victim didn't have the means to fight back? Graham's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. You're right, he admitted, and I'll make sure a full investigation is conducted. You have my word. Olivia studied him for a moment, gauging his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. I'll hold you to that, she said, and I'll be filing my own report. This can't happen again. Graham nodded, his respect for her evident in his expression. Understood. As the remaining officers began to disperse, Olivia turned back toward the lake, her gaze lingering on the calm, shimmering surface. It was almost surreal, how quickly the chaos had unfolded and subsided, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the park. She could still feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but beneath it was a deep sense of resolve. This wasn't just about holding Coulson accountable, it was about changing a system that allowed people like him to thrive. She picked up her bag and began walking toward the park exit, her steps steady and unyielding. The weight of what had just happened settled on her shoulders, but it didn't drag her down. If anything, it made her stand taller. She wasn't just a victim of Coulson's abuse of power, she was a symbol of resistance, of resilience, and of the fight for justice. And she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. As Olivia walked toward the park exit, the weight of the confrontation lingered in the air, the silence heavy and oppressive. The calm of the lake, once a symbol of peace, now felt almost mocking, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Her body ached slightly from the physicality of the encounter, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her sharp, her mind racing through what needed to happen next. She didn't have time to dwell on the incident itself, there was too much at stake. Coulson's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, and she knew that the system enabling men like him would only perpetuate such abuse if left unchecked. This wasn't just about her, it was about the countless others who didn't have the tools or the voice to fight back. Behind her, Sergeant Graham was still coordinating the scene, speaking to the other officers and ensuring witnesses were interviewed. The group of bystanders, emboldened by Olivia's composure and the sergeant's intervention, began offering their accounts. Their voices floated faintly through the air, snippets of indignation and shock filtering through the otherwise serene surroundings. Olivia didn't stop to listen. She had already decided on her next step. As she reached the edge of the park, a deep voice called out behind her, "Lieutenant Commander Carter." She turned to see Sergeant Graham jogging toward her, his expression a mix of resolve and regret. He stopped a few feet away, his hands on his hips as he caught his breath. For a moment he simply looked at her, as though weighing his words carefully. "I just want to say again how sorry I am for what happened back there," he began, his tone earnest. "Coulson's actions were completely out of line, and I want you to know that this department doesn't condone that kind of behavior." Olivia folded her arms, her gaze steady but not unkind. "With respect, Sergeant, words won't fix this. Apologies won't undo what he's done not just to me, but to anyone else he's targeted in the past. This isn't about one bad cop. It's about a system that allows people like him to feel untouchable." Graham nodded slowly, her words hitting with the weight of truth. "You're right," he admitted. "And I can promise you, there will be a thorough investigation. Coulson's career is likely over after today." Olivia's expression didn't waver. "That's a start," she said, her voice measured. "But it's not enough. You know as well as I do that firing one officer won't change the culture that enables this kind of abuse. There needs to be accountability at every level, from the ground up." Graham sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I hear you," he said, "and I'll do everything I can to push for that accountability. But change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without people like you standing up and making their voices heard." Olivia regarded him for a moment, her sharp eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. She found none. Whatever his flaws or blind spots, Graham seemed genuinely committed to doing the right thing, even if he wasn't entirely sure how. She gave a small nod, a flicker of acknowledgement crossing her features. "Then let's make sure this isn't the end of the conversation," she said. "I'll be filing a formal complaint and submitting a report to your department, as well as the Navy's legal team. And I'll be following up to ensure this investigation doesn't get swept under the rug." Graham straightened, his posture resolute. "You have my word," he said. "Coulson will face the consequences of his actions, and this department will do better." Olivia didn't respond immediately, her gaze drifting briefly to the shimmering surface of the lake. The image of Coulson's smug face as he shoved her into the water flashed in her mind, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't about him anymore, it was about the bigger picture, the systemic change that needed to happen. Good, she said finally. Because if I get even a hint that this is being handled with anything less than full transparency, I won't hesitate to escalate it further. The Navy has resources and influence that I'm not afraid to use. Graham nodded again, his expression grim. Understood, he said, and thank you for standing your ground, for making sure this doesn't get ignored. Olivia gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. It's not about gratitude, Sergeant. It's about justice. With that, she turned and walked away, her steps steady and purposeful. The tension in her chest began to ease as she left the park behind, but the fire in her gut remained, a driving force that wouldn't let her rest until she saw this through to the end. Later that evening, Olivia sat at her dining table, her laptop open in front of her. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of her fingers on the keyboard as she drafted her report. She recounted every detail of the encounter with Coulson, her words precise and unflinching. She didn't embellish or exaggerate, there was no need. The truth was damning enough on its own. As she typed, her mind drifted to the countless others who had faced similar abuse, who hadn't had the privilege of a Navy background or the confidence to stand up for themselves. She thought of the systemic issues that allowed officers like Coulson to operate unchecked, and the culture of silence that protected them. The anger she felt wasn't just for herself, it was for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. When she finished the report, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the document one last time before saving it and attaching it to an email. She addressed the email to Sergeant Graham, the Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, and the Navy's legal team. Her finger hovered over the send button for a moment, a final surge of resolve washing over her before she clicked it. It was done. The first step in a long journey toward accountability and change. As she closed her laptop, the exhaustion of the day finally began to catch up with her. She rose from the table and moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The night was still, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. For a moment she allowed herself to breathe, to let the weight of the day settle before pushing it aside. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, and Olivia Carter was ready for whatever came next. Weeks had passed since the confrontation at the lake, but its ripple effects were still unfolding. Olivia's formal complaint and detailed report had ignited a series of events that no one, least of all Officer Coulson, had anticipated. The incident had triggered an internal investigation within the local police department, and as word of what had happened spread through official channels, it began to attract attention from higher levels of authority. This wasn't just about one rogue officer anymore, it had become a litmus test for the department's integrity and accountability. Olivia stayed informed throughout the process, her Navy contacts ensuring that she had access to updates and developments. She had made it clear in her report that this wasn't a personal vendetta against Coulson. It was about addressing the culture that allowed someone like him to thrive unchecked. Still, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction when she learned that Coulson had been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. It was a small victory, but an important one. The community, too, had begun to rally in response. Witnesses from the park had come forward to give statements, many of them voicing their frustration with the behavior they had observed. For some, it was the first time they had felt empowered to speak out against misconduct. Local activists took notice, organizing forums and meetings to discuss the broader issues of racial bias and abuse of power within law enforcement. Olivia had been invited to speak at one such forum, and though she was initially hesitant, she eventually agreed. If her experience could help bring about meaningful change, she was willing to share it. The evening of the forum arrived, and Olivia found herself standing backstage at a community center, waiting to address a crowd of nearly 200 people. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation, the air thick with the weight of unspoken grievances and unfulfilled hopes. Olivia adjusted the microphone pinned to her shirt, her heartbeat steady but purposeful. She wasn't nervous. She had faced far more daunting audiences during her military career, but she felt the gravity of what this moment represented. This wasn't about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated. When her name was announced, the crowd erupted into applause. Olivia stepped onto the stage, her posture straight and commanding but not intimidating. She approached the podium and took a moment to survey the audience. There were faces of every age and background, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. She cleared her throat, her voice steady as she began to speak. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Olivia Carter, and I'm a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. But tonight, I'm here not as a military officer, but as a citizen who, like many of you, has experienced the impact of unchecked power and systemic failure." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. She recounted the events at the lake in vivid detail, her tone calm but unflinching. She described Coulson's behavior, the escalation of the situation, and her decision to stand her ground not out of defiance, but out of a sense of duty to herself and others. She didn't sugarcoat the experience or minimize its implications. She spoke of the fear, the anger, and the resolve that had driven her to act. "But this isn't just about one officer," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "This is about a culture that allows individuals like him to feel invincible. It's about a system that prioritizes power over accountability, authority over humanity. And it's about all of us, every single one of us, who have a responsibility to demand better." The crowd erupted into applause, the energy in the room shifting from solemnity to determination. Olivia let the noise settle before continuing, her tone softening but losing none of its intensity. "I'm not here to tell you that change will be easy. It won't. It will be slow, and it will require all of us to stay engaged, to stay vigilant, and to hold those in power accountable. But I believe we can do it. I believe we can create a system that serves and protects everyone equally. And I believe that starts with conversations like this, with communities coming together to demand justice." By the time she finished, the audience was on its feet, their applause reverberating through the hall like a wave of solidarity. Olivia stepped back from the podium, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and hope. She had done what she could, and now it was up to the community to carry the momentum forward. In the days that followed, the investigation into Coulson's actions reached its conclusion. The department released a public statement announcing his termination, citing gross misconduct and a violation of departmental policies. The decision sent shockwaves through the ranks, a clear message that the old ways of operating would no longer be tolerated. For Olivia, it was a moment of validation, proof that standing up to injustice could lead to real consequences. But the victory was bittersweet. She knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. Systemic change would take years, perhaps decades, and it would require relentless effort from countless individuals. Still, she allowed herself a moment to celebrate, to acknowledge the progress that had been made. One morning, as she walked along the same path by the lake where the confrontation had occurred, she noticed a group of children playing near the water. Their laughter echoed through the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the park weeks earlier. Olivia smiled faintly, her steps slowing as she approached the shoreline. She stood there for a moment, watching the sunlight dance across the water's surface, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. Lieutenant Commander Carter. She turned to see Sergeant Graham standing a few feet away, his expression respectful but tinged with something that looked like admiration. He approached her slowly, his hands clasped in front of him. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "I just wanted to thank you again. For everything." Olivia inclined her head slightly, her gaze steady. "No need to thank me, Sergeant. I just did what needed to be done." Graham nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe. But you didn't have to stick your neck out the way you did. A lot of people wouldn't have." Olivia looked back at the lake, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe that's the problem," she said quietly. "Too many people stay silent. Too many people think it's not their fight, but it is. It always is." Graham didn't respond immediately, his gaze following hers out over the water. Finally he spoke, his tone soft but firm. "Well, if you ever decide you're ready to leave the Navy, we could use someone like you here. Someone who knows what real leadership looks like." Olivia chuckled, the sound light but genuine. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. "But for now, I think I'll stick with the Navy. There's still work to be done." Graham nodded, his expression one of quiet respect. "Fair enough. Just know you've got allies here, if you ever need them." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Olivia alone with her thoughts. She stayed by the lake for a while longer, the gentle breeze ruffling her hair as she reflected on everything that had happened. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Change was possible, and she was ready to keep fighting for it, one battle at a time.